What happens to a civilization so large it can't fit inside our history books? It gets called myth. But here's the problem with that answer. Myths don't leave footprints in stone. They don't carve doorways 14 feet high into solid granite. They don't engineer canal systems that still redirect water after 5,000 years of neglect. Myths don't have a waste management problem. Giants do. And that is where this story begins. Not with religion, not with legend, but with a logistical problem so enormous, so physical, so stubbornly biological, that it forces us to take the Nephilim seriously in a way that theological debate never quite manages. If they were real, and the convergent testimony of over 200 independent cultural traditions across every inhabited continent suggests something real is buried inside these stories, then they were real all the way down. Not just in their wars, not just in their architecture, real in their bodies, real in their smell, real in the daily, unglamorous, unavoidable work of keeping a massive biological organism alive and functional in a world without a single piece of modern infrastructure. So, who were they? The word Nephilim appears in Genesis, but the concept predates the Bible by centuries. The Sumerian king list, clay tablets recording rulers from before a catastrophic flood, describes kings with reigns of thousands of years governing cities we can partially locate on modern maps. The Book of Enoch, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and treated as authoritative scripture by early Jewish communities and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to this day, describes them in terms that are striking precisely because of their specificity. Not gods floating above the physical world. Beings with height, with appetite, with strength that made them terrifying and useful in equal measure. Offspring of the Watchers, entities that descended and intermixed with human populations, producing a hybrid race that was neither fully divine nor fully human. In physical terms, enormous. Ancient accounts vary, but cluster around a consistent range. Beings between 4 and 6 meters tall. Some traditions go higher. Even at the conservative end of that range, 4 meters, roughly 13 feet, you are describing something that changes every single calculation about how a city functions. Picture it cinematically, because that's the only way the scale lands properly. A Nephilim warrior standing at the edge of a pre-flood city. The walls behind him are massive, not because the architects wanted to impress, but because the architecture had to accommodate inhabitants for whom a standard human doorway would be a crawl space. The streets are wide, wider than any street in ancient Rome, wider than anything we'd expect from a civilization this old. Not for carts, not for processions, for bodies that require space to move without destroying everything around them. The ground shakes slightly when they walk, not from supernatural power, from mass, basic physics. A being 10 to 15 times heavier than an adult human transfers that weight to the earth with every step, and the earth responds accordingly. Now hold that image, and ask the question nobody asks in these documentaries. That being has a body. A massive, metabolically active body that produces heat, consumes enormous quantities of food, generates proportionally enormous quantities of waste, sweats, accumulates biological residue on its skin, and requires regular maintenance to remain functional rather than diseased. How does it stay clean? That question isn't trivial. That question is civilizational. Because hygiene is not a luxury that advanced societies eventually get around to. Hygiene is infrastructure. Hygiene is the difference between a city that sustains a population for centuries and a city that kills itself from within in a generation. Rome dominated the ancient world in part because of the Cloaca Maxima, its sewer system, still partially functional today. The Black Death killed a third of medieval Europe not because the plague bacterium was unstoppable, but because sanitation had collapsed so completely that the vector, rats, fleas, contaminated water, could move through populations without resistance. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the oldest urban cultures on record, had covered drainage and flush toilets 4,000 years ago and thrived for centuries. When their sanitation systems degraded, so did they. Sanitation is not detail. Sanitation is the foundation everything else rests on. And for a civilization that included beings producing 10 to 15 times the biological waste of an average human adult, that foundation had to be engineered to a standard we have never had to match. Here is what makes the pre-flood world genuinely strange from an environmental standpoint, and why the hygiene question has answers that actually make sense once you understand the context. Genesis chapter 2 contains a detail most readers skip. Before the flood, it did not rain. A mist rose from the earth to water the ground. Atmospheric physicists, working from this description, and from what the fossil record tells us about pre-flood environmental conditions, have proposed the existence of a vapor canopy, a layer of water vapor in the upper atmosphere creating a global greenhouse effect, higher atmospheric pressure, higher oxygen content, uniform temperatures across latitudes that are now desert or tundra, and water, not falling from the sky in concentrated events, but present everywhere, rising from the ground, feeding springs and rivers with a consistency that the post-flood world simply doesn't replicate. For a civilization without modern plumbing, this is everything. Because hygiene, in any era, in any civilization, with any size of inhabitant, begins with one thing: access to clean, moving water. The Nephilim had it, everywhere, all the time. Which means the question isn't whether they could maintain hygiene. The question is how they engineered that hygiene around bodies that broke every normal assumption about scale. That answer, built from ancient texts, archaeological anomalies, biological logic, and the environmental reconstruction of a world we can only partially glimpse, is what this series is built to find. Because the giants were real enough to build cities, and real enough to need to clean them. 13 feet tall. Imagine what that means for a bar of soap. You'd need 1,000 of them, daily. And soap, as we manufacture it, didn't exist. So here is the engineering problem, stated without mythology. A Nephilim body, 4 to 6 meters of dense biological mass, active, working, fighting, building in a pre-industrial tropical greenhouse world, accumulates skin oils, dead cells, biological residue, and microbial populations the same way every mammalian body does. At greater scale, the accumulation is greater. At greater scale, the consequences of neglect are faster and more severe. Skin infections in beings this size don't stay local, they go systemic. And a systemic infection in a commander, a builder, a leader, in any key individual in a civilization with limited medical intervention, can end careers, disrupt governance, compromise military capacity. Hygiene wasn't vanity for the Nephilim, it was operational necessity. So what did they use? Start with what the environment provided, because that's where every pre-industrial hygiene system starts. The pre-flood world, lush, humid, water saturated, with rivers fed by springs and a water table close to the surface almost everywhere, offered something that modern people systematically underestimate: clay. Not just any clay, specifically the fine-grained mineral sediment that accumulates in river bends where current slows. What modern chemistry now identifies as smectite or bentonite clay, and what ancient populations on every continent independently discovered and used for bodily cleansing long before anyone understood why it worked. Here's why it works. Bentonite clay carries a slight negative electrical charge on its surface. That charge attracts and binds positively charged ions, which include oils, heavy metals, and the surface proteins of bacterial cells. When applied to skin, wetted, and worked in with friction, clay doesn't just scrub mechanically. It chemically draws contaminants out of pores and off the skin surface, then carries them away when rinsed. It is, in precise terms, a natural surfactant system, not a metaphor for cleaning. Actual cleaning, confirmed by modern dermatological research. The evidence for ancient clay-based hygiene is not speculative. It is documented across cultures with no known contact. Ancient Egyptians mixed Nile clay with vegetable oils for ritual and practical cleansing. Indigenous populations across North and South America used white and gray clay as deodorant, skin treatment, and general cleanser. Communities across the Indian subcontinent washed hair with clay and plant extract mixtures, a practice that persists in some regions today. In each tradition, the knowledge appears older than the culture preserving it. as if the discovery predates the civilization claiming it. The Book of Enoch is specific about what the Watchers transmitted to human populations. Among the list, metallurgy, astronomical calculation, the use of roots and medicinal plants, and the translation varies by manuscript, but the functional meaning is consistent, the means of purifying and adorning the body. Purifying the body, written in a text preserved for millennia in a cave near the Dead Sea. For Nephilim, operating at 4 to 6 meters, clay-based cleansing at a river would have been the logical system, not primitive improvisation, but optimal use of available resources. A river provides both the moving water needed for rinsing and, in its sediment deposits, the clay needed for cleansing. The system scales. A being who needs to clean a body surface area 4 times greater than a human's simply uses more clay, spends more time in deeper water, and works with the same principles. But skin is only one surface. Oral hygiene, the cleanliness of teeth, gums, and oral cavity, is where ancient solutions were arguably more sophisticated than most people realize, and where the stakes for a Nephilim were particularly high. A jaw infection in a being with a proportionally massive oral cavity, in a world without antibiotics, could be fatal within weeks. Dental decay creates chronic systemic inflammation that degrades immune function over time. For the Nephilim, whose military and organizational roles within their civilizations made individual incapacitation genuinely consequential, oral health wasn't cosmetic, it was strategic, the ancient world's solution. Specific plants with confirmed antibacterial chemistry. The miswak, a chewing stick made from the Salvadora persica tree, used continuously in Middle Eastern and African traditions for over 1,000 years and still used by hundreds of millions today, contains alkaloids, fluoride compounds, and silica that modern microbiological studies confirm inhibit the growth of Streptococcus mutans, the primary bacterium responsible for tooth decay. Other plants used in traditional oral hygiene across African, South Asian, and Mesoamerican cultures contain demonstrably similar biochemical profiles, despite those cultures having no contact with each other. The pattern is the same as with clay, independent convergence on solutions that actually work, appearing in traditions that describe the knowledge as ancient even from their own historical vantage point. For Nephilim, beings whose diet, based on ancient descriptions, included enormous quantities of meat and required significant jaw force to process, plant-based oral hygiene would have been integrated into daily routine, not because they read about it, because populations that didn't do it got sick and died faster than populations that did. And here is the paradox that makes this genuinely compelling rather than merely interesting. We tend to look at pre-industrial hygiene and see primitive approximation of what we do better. We assume the direction of progress is always from dirty to clean, from crude to sophisticated. But the evidence from ancient hygiene systems doesn't support that assumption. It supports a different story, one where sophisticated practical knowledge existed before the civilizations we can document, was partially preserved through catastrophe in the form of ritual and tradition, and is only now being confirmed by the biochemistry and materials science that finally gives us the vocabulary to understand what was already known. The Nephilim didn't invent modern hygiene poorly. They solved their hygiene problem completely, with the tools their world provided, at the scale their bodies required. The clay is still in the river. The plants still grow on the bank. The knowledge outlasted the civilization that generated it. What we call ancient wisdom, they called Tuesday morning. 1. Nephilim. One day. Conservatively, 2 kilograms of solid biological waste. Multiply that by 300 individuals in a single city. Add a human population of several thousand living in close proximity. Factor in the food processing waste, the animal husbandry, the biological residue of an active civilization operating in a humid, warm environment where decomposition is fast but pathogen growth is faster. You have, in logistical terms, one of the most complex sanitation problems any civilization has ever faced. And they solved it. They had to. Because cities that don't solve it don't survive long enough to appear in ancient records. And the Nephilim appear in ancient records consistently, across cultures, as long-established civilizations with cities, hierarchies, and multi-generational continuity. That continuity is itself evidence of functional sanitation. You cannot sustain a large urban population across generations without managing biological waste. The timeline simply doesn't permit it. Waterborne disease alone, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, can collapse a city's population within months when waste contaminates water supplies. The fact that Nephilim cities are described as enduring, powerful, and populous is, paradoxically, one of the strongest arguments that their sanitation worked. So how did it work? The answer comes from three converging sources: the environmental logic of the pre-flood world, the archaeological evidence from the earliest post-flood civilizations, and the practical engineering principles that all successful pre-industrial sanitation systems share regardless of culture or era. The pre-flood environment offered one advantage that changes every calculation: abundant moving water everywhere. Rivers fed by springs, not rainfall, providing consistent flow year-round without the seasonal fluctuation that makes hydraulic waste management unreliable in modern river systems. Moving water dilutes biological waste at a rate that standing water cannot approach, and channels it away from population centers when the hydraulics are properly managed. Every ancient civilization that engineered effectively with water, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, used channeled water flow as the primary mechanism for waste removal. The sophistication wasn't in inventing the principle. The sophistication was in the engineering of channels, gradients, and separation systems that kept wastewater from recontaminating clean water sources. For Nephilim cities, the hydraulic advantage of the pre-flood world would have made this engineering more tractable, not less. More water means more dilution capacity. More consistent flow means more reliable transport. The challenge was scale, designing systems that could handle waste volumes an order of magnitude larger than human-scale systems, and separation, keeping the enormous quantities of Nephilim waste away from the water supplies the human population depended on. Here is where the archaeological record of early post-flood civilizations becomes genuinely provocative. Mohenjo-Daro, a city of the Indus Valley civilization dating to 2500 BCE, had sanitation infrastructure that archaeologists still describe with barely concealed astonishment. Every major structure connected to covered brick drains. Public facilities designed for organized high-volume use. A citywide sewage network more sophisticated than anything in Europe until the Roman period, 3,000 years later. No evolutionary progression explains it. No simpler predecessor systems have been found. The infrastructure appears in the archaeological record essentially complete. The standard explanation is independent invention by a sophisticated culture. That explanation requires us to believe that the Indus Valley populations solved, from scratch in a single generation, an engineering problem that took most of the ancient world millennia to approach. There is another explanation. They remembered, not consciously perhaps, but in the way that practical knowledge survives civilizational catastrophe, encoded in practice, in construction habit, in the accumulated understanding of builders whose grandparents had seen larger systems work and passed down the principles without always passing down the context. The Book of Deuteronomy, written long after the flood but preserving traditions whose origins it doesn't fully explain, contains a passage that has puzzled commentators for centuries. It instructs soldiers in the field to carry a digging implement, move outside the camp perimeter to relieve themselves, and bury the waste completely. The text frames this as a sacred obligation. Strip away the theological framing, and what you have is a field sanitation protocol that modern military medical doctrine would recognize as correct and necessary. Why does a religious text contain precise field sanitation instructions? Because the knowledge that biological waste kills populations had been encoded in sacred obligation specifically to ensure compliance after the scientific reasoning behind it was no longer available. The ritual preserved the function when the explanation was lost. This pattern, practical knowledge migrating into religious requirement as civilizational context is stripped away, repeats across ancient traditions with striking consistency. Hindu purity laws specify waste management and personal hygiene practices that align with effective disease prevention when analyzed through a modern public health lens. Ancient Egyptian religious requirements for priestly cleanliness, functioned as infection control protocols for the population centers around temples. The convergence isn't theological coincidence. It's the same underlying knowledge, expressed in the only containers durable enough to survive catastrophe. For the Nephilim, operating before that catastrophe, the knowledge wouldn't have been ritual. It would have been operational, infrastructure, engineered into cities the way the Indus Valley populations engineered it, but at the scale that the Indus Valley populations, rebuilding from fragmentary memory, could only approximate. And the waste management problem extended beyond the cities themselves. Nephilim, according to ancient accounts, were military. They campaigned. They moved across territory without established infrastructure, and an army that doesn't manage its waste dies from dysentery before it reaches the enemy. A military reality as true in the pre-flood world as it was in the American Civil War, where disease killed more soldiers than combat by a ratio of 2-to-1. Field sanitation for Nephilim-scale forces would have required the same principles in a mobile context. Distance from water sources, burial depth sufficient to prevent groundwater contamination, site rotation to prevent soil saturation. Not sophisticated technology. Disciplined practice. The kind of practice that gets encoded in military tradition and eventually, when the military context is gone, in religious law. The paradox at the center of this episode is worth sitting with. We assume that ancient peoples were unhygienic because they lacked our technology. But the evidence consistently suggests the opposite, that they understood the relationship between waste management and population health with a precision that we only rediscovered through germ theory in the 19th century. The knowledge existed before the science that explains it. Someone figured out that waste kills, long before anyone understood why. And the civilization that had the most urgent reason to figure it out, the one managing the largest biological waste problem in pre-flood history, left its solutions encoded in the foundations of every sanitation tradition that came after. We're still building on those foundations. We just forgot who poured them. The flood erased the cities. It did not erase what the cities knew. That distinction is the key to understanding why ancient civilizations that should have been primitive weren't. Why the Indus Valley had sewage systems that baffled modern archaeologists. Why Egyptian priests followed cleansing protocols that functioned as effective infection control centuries before anyone understood infection. Why religious texts across 3 major world religions contain detailed, specific, functionally correct hygiene instructions embedded in sacred law. Knowledge doesn't drown. It transforms. It migrates into the practices of survivors who may not fully understand what they're preserving, but who preserve it because it works, and because the people who taught them were insistent enough about it that the practice outlasted the explanation. Picture the transmission this way. A human woman who spent her life in a Nephilim city, who watched the clay-gathering rituals at dawn, who understood which section of the river was designated for washing and which for waste, who lived near the engineered channels that kept the city's biological output away from its water supply, survives the flood. She has children. She teaches them what she knows, the way all survivors teach, not as historical record, but as practice. This is how you wash. This is where waste goes. This is which plant cleans your teeth. Her children teach their children. The explanation erodes over generations. The practice remains. By the time those practices appear in written records, Sumerian hygiene texts, Egyptian medical papyri, the sanitation laws of Deuteronomy, the purity codes of ancient Hindu tradition, they are already ancient. Already presented as received wisdom rather than discovered knowledge. Already framed in the language of sacred obligation rather than practical engineering. Because sacred obligation is the most durable container for knowledge that has outlived its original context. The Book of Enoch describes the Watcher's transmitted knowledge in a list that is notable for its specificity: metallurgy, astronomy, the use of medicinal roots and plants, and the purification of the body. This isn't a list of mystical gifts, it's a curriculum. Practical knowledge about how to work with physical reality, metal, sky, plant, body, transmitted to human populations that would need it. And then the flood came, and most of the beings who held that knowledge in its complete form were gone. What remained were the humans who had lived adjacent to that knowledge, who had participated in its applications without necessarily understanding its foundations, who carried practices without always carrying principles, rituals without always carrying reasons. This is why the convergences in ancient hygiene traditions are so striking and so hard to explain through parallel, independent invention alone. Bentonite clay appears as a cleansing agent in ancient Egypt, in indigenous North American tradition, in South Asian cosmetic practice, in sub-Saharan African body care. Not similar clays, used in vaguely similar ways. The same type of mineral-rich river sediment, used in the same applications, in cultures with no known contact. The convergence is too specific for coincidence and too widespread for regional diffusion alone. Plant-based antimicrobial oral hygiene, functionally identical despite different specific plants, appears in Middle Eastern, African, South Asian, and Mesoamerican traditions. Modern biochemistry confirms that the plants chosen in each tradition contain genuine antibacterial compounds effective against oral pathogens. They didn't choose randomly, they chose correctly, independently, in traditions that each describe the knowledge as ancient even from their own historical vantage point. Hydraulic waste separation, the principle that biological waste must be channeled away from water sources and human habitation through engineered drainage, appears as foundational infrastructure in the Indus Valley, in ancient Mesopotamian cities, in Egyptian settlements along the Nile, and in the engineering logic of early Chinese urban centers, each appearing with a sophistication that the archaeological record doesn't adequately explain through local development. The mainstream answer is parallel invention. Smart people solving similar problems reach similar solutions. That's possible, and it deserves to remain on the table. But consider the alternative carefully. A pre-flood civilization that had to solve hygiene at a scale no post-flood civilization has ever faced. Beings 4 to 6 meters tall, living in dense urban populations, producing waste volumes that would collapse any inadequately managed city within a generation, worked out over centuries of necessity and accumulated knowledge. A comprehensive system for maintaining cleanliness without modern infrastructure. And when that civilization was largely destroyed, the humans who had lived within it carried fragments of that system forward. Not the engineering drawings, not the scientific principles, the practices, the habits, the deeply ingrained knowledge that this is how you clean a body, this is where waste goes, this is which plant you use for which purpose. Encoded first in memory, then in tradition, then in religious law, then in the foundations of civilizations that came after. Each one a little further from the original source, each one preserving less of the context while preserving more of the practice, until the practice is so embedded in culture and religion that nobody asks where it came from anymore. We are at the end of that chain. We wash our hands without knowing that the specific protocol we follow descends from practices developed in a world that predates recorded history. We build sanitation systems on hydraulic principles first engineered in cities wide enough for giants to walk through. We use clay-based compounds in our skincare products without knowing that the clay was the technology long before the product was. And we look at ancient peoples, at the Nephilim specifically, and call them primitive because they didn't have our infrastructure. But here is the final provocation this series leaves you with. They didn't need our infrastructure. They had something better. Knowledge so precisely calibrated to the physical world that it worked without factories, without chemistry labs, without plumbing, without any of the systems we consider essential. Knowledge that solved a hygiene problem larger than any we have ever faced. Knowledge that survived a catastrophe that erased almost everything else. Knowledge that we are still using today, in forms so transformed by time that we no longer recognize it as knowledge at all. The giants are gone. The flood erased their cities. The archaeology gives us fragments too strange to fit neatly into our existing timelines. But the clay is still in the river, and somewhere in the practices we call common sense. Wash your hands, separate your waste from your water, use the plant that cleans. There is the echo of a civilization enormous enough to shake the ground when it walked, still teaching us, long after it disappeared.